Welcome to Undiet Your Coaching podcast. I'm Stephanie Dodier, clinical nutritionist and creator of the Going to Beyond the Food method, and I'm on a mission to help all coaches undiet their life and their coaching business. Ready? Let's do this. Welcome back to the podcast, my dear colleague. Today, we're going to deep dive into a topic that I answer over and over, which is the difference between eating disorder and disordered eating. And we're going to do that with a dear colleague of mine, Marie-Pier from the Balanced Dietitian. And yes, we are both French Canadian. So if you are sensitive to the French accent, today on this podcast, you're going to get it both ways. Now, before we roll into discussing this very important topic for all of us to practice with integrity with our clients, because many of us are not equipped to work with eating disorder and we must refer out. So we need to be able to understand the difference between eating disorder and disordered eating. But before we get into that, I wanted to highlight something that I believe to be really important, which is enrollment season for the non-diet coaching certification is getting started on October 28th, 2023. So every cohort, by the way, we're going to be on cohort number 9. You believe that? 9 cohort. We're walking in to our 5th year of running the non-diet training program for professional. Just saying that, my mind is like blowing up. Anyway, we enroll into kind of 2 batches. We do the early enrollment, which is going to happen this year, October 28th to November the 1st. For those that are already knowing this is what you're going to do, you are all in. You want to take part of the early enrollment because it gives you access to 2 very important and exciting bonus. One being an extended payment plan for 8 months. So the way the pricing works for our training program, it's a sliding scale. So go to our website. The link is in the show notes. Read the instruction about selecting the best pricing for you based on your current financial privilege. Once you've selected the right sliding scale pricing for you, then we will take that pricing divided by 8 and you will start on payment plan October the 28th at no additional cost to you, and it will be spread over 8 months. The other bonus, which I think is super cool, is the Jumpstart program. It's something I created 2 years ago, which is to help people onboard some of the knowledge earlier so that they can feel ready when we start the cohort on January. So the Jumpstart program, as soon as you've made your first payment towards your tuition, we give you your ID, and then you can start taking some of the course inside the student portal. What I do, which is the coolness of it all, is I get you to take an assessment, and then based on the result of your assessment, I suggest an individual track for you to study prior of us starting in January 1st. So you have 2 months with an individual track for you to start studying where you have the biggest gap, so you feel more equipped, prepared, and ready to go in the first week of January when we get started as a group. So if you want to take part of this, be sure to be on our wait list, because the information, the access link to early registration will be sent to the people who have told us they want to join on the wait list. So the link to the non-diet coaching certification is in the show note, or you can go to my website, stephaniedodier.com/professional, and you will see the certification and a button for you to join the wait list. Can't wait to work with many of you that are listening to this podcast. Okay. We're going to talk about the difference between eating disorder and disordered eating. So my team will roll in the very joyful interview with my French colleague, Marie-Pier, right now. Welcome back to the podcast, my sisters. Today we have Marie-Pier and I'm pronouncing it in French because she is French like me. She's a registered dietitian with a degree in psychology. She is the founder and lead clinician at Balance Practice, where people are being helped both with disordered eating and eating disorder. So I want to ask the very first question. How did you end up in psychology as a dietitian? Or was it the reverse?
Wow, that's a good question. I actually started, it's actually a whole journey. I started biochemistry because I love science. And then easily went from like, I don't want to do biochemistry. It's like, I need people.
It's boring.
I'm like, I don't want to work in a lab. So then led to psychology. I've always been very interested with like human behavior. And I think it comes from the fact that we are 8 siblings at home. So we're a lot of people and a lot of different people with a lot of emotions and a lot of different perspectives. And family dinners are always great. So I really got interested in psychology as my first degree. And then once I finished psychology, I was really young. I got to university when I was 16. So I graduated my first degree at 20, which was wild. And at that time, didn't really know what I was going to do. Had developed an eating disorder based on so many different things. And through my eating disorder recovery, then decided to go back to school to become a registered dietitian. So nutrition came after psychology, but I will say that without psychology, I don't know that I could do the work that I do with eating disorder folks.
Yes, and that's actually why I got attracted to you when I met you on social media, is because you weren't the traditional approach to food and nutrition as a dietitian. You were more in my field of like, it starts with your thoughts and your feelings. So we're connecting well in that. But the reason I want to have you on the podcast today is to clarify, and this is where your specialty is going to come in, how to see the difference between eating disordered and disordered eating. So we're going to start with that basic question. What is the difference and what is each one of them varies and differs?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a really good question. I think the more that I work in this field, the more that my own like perception of it shifts a little bit. So right now, the way that I really see it and what I use often with clients is really like eating spectrum. So the way we eat, our relationship with food, our relationship to your body falls somewhere on a spectrum from intuitive eating all the way to having an eating disorder. So between those two, there's quite a lot of gray area where we have, honestly, I think like, I don't know, I don't want to put a number, but I would say like 85% of population lives in the disordered eating space in 2023 when we live in diet culture. So folks typically don't just wake up with an eating disorder one day. It's typically something that's either developed over time with multiple different risk factors and sometimes a triggering event. So what I would say is when we think of the difference between disordered eating and eating disorder, maybe more in terms of the intensity of the disordered behaviors, the frequency of the eating disorder behaviors, and even in terms of like functioning and life quality. So often what we have and something that we use at the practice is rating kind of life quality and how we feel about our life and our perception of, our daily living. And often what we see is that folks who have eating disorders tend to be more highly impacted. And on the second note of that is there's also, depending on the type of eating disorder, the physical body can be quite impacted as well. So with disordered eating, we may see some health condition that come from it, but it's less there in comparison to kind of like the brain, the mindset, and like some of the rigidities and like the food behaviors. But with eating disorders, we can start seeing some like very big impact on the physical body as well.
So you're talking about health condition coming from the eating disorder.
Yeah. So we can see, especially with like anorexia, bulimia, ARFID, we can see like that heavily restriction over time can cause quite a lot of damage to the body and even to the brain. Like it's really interesting when they look at neurobiology of eating disorders and you see like brain shifting and neurotransmitters like not being able to be released the same way. So there's a lot of impact on the way our body starts functioning.
So given our audience, which are coaches, non-licensed professional, or even if they're licensed, they don't have skills to treat eating disorder, how would you help a coach, we'll call them my audience a coach, to distinguish between the two if they have not been diagnosed by a health professional before coming to them?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a hard question because even in my profession, like as a dietitian, like I cannot diagnose folks, right? Like it's not my role. However, we can be very aware of the diagnosis criteria. So that's definitely something that I would suggest. Like if you are a coach and you're working with someone, being aware of like, okay, so what are the types of eating disorders? So we're going to start from top to bottom. This is just like how I have it in my brain.
It's on a scale from the worst to the better. It's just
No, there's no scale. They're all,
Yeah.
and like, that's actually a really important point because I think in eating disorder world, there is a hierarchy of eating disorder.
Oh.
Yeah, where like sometimes some folks, especially in eating world, believe that anorexia is better than binge eating, and it has to do with fat phobia.
Really?
Like a lot of folks who are in the thinner bodies and have an eating disorder are perceived as better eating disorders than others. So
Interesting. What do you find when you talk to specialists? Like, would have never thought of that happening.
yeah, it's pretty wild. So this is a great opportunity to say that there's no better, there's no worse.
No.
They're also real and they all deserve help. We start with anorexia nervosa, which is probably the eating disorder that's most commonly known. And it is a very much a restrictive type of eating disorder. So it's an eating disorder where the energy balance starts to be highly impacted that will lead most likely to weight loss. There is oftentimes also they call it like the fat phobia, right? A lot of fear of gaining weight, a lot of fear of fatness. And there is body dysmorphia that can be attached to that eating disorder as well. There are two subtypes with anorexia. There is just the restrictive type where the person will be, restricting their intake or over-exercising, anything to have that energy balance being lower, again, to lead to a physical change in the body. Or there is also the binge purge subtype. So folks can have anorexia and still engage in those types of behaviors as well and still lead to weight loss as well.
Okay.
So that's for anorexia nervosa. Typically, like if I see someone coming in clinically, we're going to be looking at, have we lost weight over the last period of time? And is it a severe weight loss that we have? The rigidity of the rules and how often we are eating and the frequency and the amount. So when it gets to a point where we're like very much under eating, so it's not just like, like I'm afraid of carbs, so I eat less carbs. It's like very rigid. And like even the thinking process becomes extremely rigid in that way. So that's for anorexia nervosa. Then we get to bulimia nervosa, which is really this cycle of restriction, binge, purge that continues over time, typically happens 3 times a week over a period of 3 months to be able to be diagnosed. And then within this eating disorder, there's often body image issues as well that present.
And in order for you to experience bulimia, I'm careful with my word here, the purging must be involved.
The purging must be involved. Yeah. And purging is defined as either like vomiting or it can be using laxatives or diuretics. So it's not always like purging by vomiting. It can be other things as well. But yeah, purging does need to be involved in this cycle. Bulimia is really difficult as well because it can go unnoticed because there's typically not any like changes physically that most people see. And so folks like can really like suffer with that in silence. Whereas anorexia, there can be a lot more telltale signs. So yeah. And then we have binge eating disorder, which is having binge eating episodes at least 3 times a week over a period of 3 months. With binge eating episode, there is no compensation to the binge. Now, this is what it says in the DSM in terms of like, and no like purging compensations. However, what we actually see in practice is that most people who binge also restrict. It may not be as severely as maybe anorexia, for example, but there is, I want to say like 99.9% of the time, some type of restriction still within the mix.
There's a compensation for the binging. That's what I used to do, was a restriction for the binge. I wasn't vomiting, but I was restricting. It was a payback for.
Exactly. Or you don't eat through the day because I'm not hungry, quote unquote, or whatever. It just like continues that cycle. And then binge eating disorder is also associated with really high distress, guilt, and shame regarding the behavior. Some people will also name that they kind of go into like autopilot during the binge, that we're not like fully conscious. It feels very much like an urge, like not a decision that we make to binge. And then something that I always like to talk about with binge is that I think this word has now been used everywhere for all the things. So I think it's something as like coaches or as providers is important to know what a binge versus overeating almost.
Sonny, I just thought on that 2 hours ago in my certification. So I would love to hear you talk about the difference between the two.
Yeah, because it's really hard because we'll have somebody come in and be like, yeah, I have binge eating disorder.
Binge.
Okay, like, can you like tell us about it? Like, yeah, I ate 2 cookies after dinner and it's distressing. Like you can tell that they're distressed.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's not to invalidate the experience, but it's to put into perspective that one, diet culture really fucked us up in terms of how much food is too much food. Like 2 cookies is chill, but the relationship to food here is impaired. But when we think of a binge, it's a very large amount of food consumed in a very small amount of time. There's nothing objective about it in DSM. It's more subjective. If you were to see someone sitting down and eating that amount of food at that time, most folks would be like, wow, that's a lot of food. That's kind of like the definition of it. So a little bit subjective, but we could probably all agree that 2 cookies is pretty much normal, right? It's not really a binge. So I think it's something that we can definitely validate our clients with in terms of like, it sounds like it's very distressing to you and it's a lot. And like, let's unpack that together while knowing that like, it's not really a binge in terms of like the clinical term.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said, because we use binge as a shame mechanism in diet culture. Mm-hmm. So now everything becomes a binge. That's somebody who was a binge eater, and I probably would have been classified as an eating disorder, would have not been fat. Because I was fat, the whole eating disorder was never diagnosed. And anyway, it's my past. We've healed from that, but it's just a fact when you live in a large body, usually you don't get diagnosed with an eating disorder.
100%. I know I was diagnosed with atypical anorexia, which is basically you have anorexia, but you're big. So who cares?
Yeah.
It just is, fat phobia is in our medical system and it does show up in eating disorder.
And binging was not 2 cookies. It was large amounts of food and a lot of disconnection. It was like to forget something, to numb something. It was a tool to avoid something else that was going on. It was just not overeating.
Yeah. Yeah. And the relationship becomes very, very different, right? Because like, I think another conception is that people don't binge because they like food. You're not like, oh, yay, cookies, like yum. Like I want the taste of it, right? A binge is typically not a really pleasant experience for most folks. Like we're not really getting that dopamine release. Like by that time, it's more that like numbing effect and sedation that folks kind of like look for.
Yeah. And it feels terrible after, emotionally and physically.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like a lot of physical discomfort because of the volume and the rapidity to which I was eating the food.
Yeah. And most folks will report that as well, right? Like it just feels awful. And because of that like uncomfortableness in the body too, it can kind of force us to slow down though, right? Like you're not going to go out and do all the things or be blah, blah, blah. Like
for sure.
So a lot of our like high achievers, like they really see the binge and the way that the binge plays a role into their life is that it allows me to slow down. It allows me to stop. And it's really interesting when we think about like how food can start playing these different roles. Although long-term maladaptive, because like there's so much guilt and shame that it really isn't as helpful, but in the moment can be extremely protective and helpful.
Yeah. Was that it for the type? There's more. There's one
I really want to talk about, and it's ARFID. This one is new-ish. It came out in 2013. It's something that I had to practice. Like when I first started the first year, we had 2 folks with ARFID. This year, I think we've had like 30 by this point. Like there's just a lot more, but I think it's because there's a lot more awareness regarding ARFID.
Okay.
Really good. So that's avoid and restrictive food intake disorder. So this is also a restrictive type of disorder, but it has nothing to do with, it's not like anorexia where it's like necessarily a fear of food for like afraid of like body image or anything like that. It typically, it has 3 subtypes. So the first one can be a sensitivity. So when we and some folks have what we call like hypersensitivity to food or sensory. So the textures of food is really intense for them. The taste of food can be really intense for them, which can create a lot of anxiety around trying new foods or just like disgust for food in general. So we can imagine that like everything was just like you're a hyper taster and you taste everything really intensely. And for some folks, it gets like almost too overwhelming. We also have just low interest or low appetite for food. And that's a biological predisposition in some folks where they don't actually release the same amount of dopamine when they eat food, and they can have a very high interoception of their body. So when they're eating the food, they can feel their fullness coming in, and there's quite a lot of, again, a sensory there. So the interest for food can be very, very low. And then the last one is just a food aversion related to a traumatic experience. So we have those who vomited, who choked on food, and then they're like afraid of food or afraid of gagging or any of those types of biological reflex regarding food that will lead to a very low intake of food.
Do you think it has to do with the hyper awareness on neurodivergence? Because as you're describing the symptoms of that, I can see a lot of neurodivergent folks experiencing that.
Yeah, there's a very high overlap between neurodivergence, especially with autism and ARFID.
Yes.
That's definitely a thing.
And is there still an eating disorder called orthorexia?
So it's not yet in the DSM, but
Okay.
they do a proposition. So we have the criteria, like what that would be. It's not currently in there, but like I think it's just an amount of time, because it's really, when we think about it, any eating disorder, it's a mental illness, right? So it's about food, but it's not really about food. It's just really how food is being utilized in the mental illness. And orthorexia is exactly that. This obsession with healthy eating and this control that we have with food and this hyper value that we put on ourselves and on food. So, I mean, in a couple of years, we'll have this conversation again. You'll be, yes.
Well, it's like diet culture and wellness culture. Wellness culture, people's awareness are coming up. So orthorexia will just be connected to wellness culture because that's where it comes from in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. 100%. And like wellness culture is diet culture.
Yeah.
It's same.
So now what about disordered eating? So we've got those eating disorder. Now what about disordered eating?
So I find this super hard because I feel like it's kind of like we're trying to separate these things that are very, very similar. Because in someone who has disordered eating, you can have a lot of similarities with all of these things.
Yeah.
It may just be, again, the frequency or the intensity of it, or maybe it's like your ability to cope with other things that may not be there as well. Whereas with an eating disorder, it's more like that clinical side where like, okay, now body's impacted, mind's impacted, like now we're extremely stuck in these cycles. Whereas with disordered eating, it's kind of that slippery slope towards the ED. However, it can be, and I'm really careful with trying to say like less severe. So it's not that it's not severe in the sense that we still need help. We still need support when we have disordered eating. And we may be, functioning in our society, which in itself can be really dangerous because it can go unnoticed for a really long time. So when we have disordered eating and we're still able to have a job and like take care of our kids and do whatever, we may feel like it's not that bad, but it is that bad. We just need to bring that awareness there too. So I would say that like the symptoms, the behaviors can look very, very similar when we think about the disordered eating.
Yeah.
It might just be, again, like the frequency, the intensity, and even like the ability to engage in recovery in comparison to when we have an eating disorder. And the last thing I just want to say about this is that we also know that 25 to 35% of folks who start dieting end up having an eating disorder. So it's also like a very slippery slope that there's quite a lot of people who like, they have disordered eating now, but as they continue down that path of disordered eating, inevitably it leads to developing an eating disorder.
Would it be fair to say that if you're a coach and you're not skilled in eating disorder, the other lens you could look at this is the impact on the overall life and the impact on the health, or the health, I don't want to say status, but the health status, for lack of a better word, of your client?
Oh, 100%. Like, I think the things we would look at is definitely the medical stability. So if they're not medically stable, or again, their health is impaired due to the eating disorder, 100%, or disordered eating or whatever. But life quality as well. And some things we'll do oftentimes too is just like even that mind map of like, how much time are we spending thinking about food in our body, and how much maybe experience are we not engaging in because of how we feel in food in our body? And then we can see based on that impact, yeah, it's probably an eating disorder. That's probably where we are at. And there is that line, when I think of my spectrum, there's always a line where it becomes an eating disorder, where it's like, oh, official, now you have the stamp and the diagnosis. But we also have the subclinical eating disorders, which is like someone who is living with an eating disorder, but doesn't have the diagnosis or is not able to kind of place their experience in that lens and still is an eating disorder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And struggling also with the process that you have for coaching them. Like they're really, what I have found over the years, they're really, really resistant to any advice or tools you're trying to use to help them. There's a lot of resistance that mindset work won't help them. They really need to go into more advanced treatments for their mental health.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point too. If you're finding that what you would typically teach, you're like, oh, it's just not enough for this person, or even with this, we're having a really hard time engaging in those like healing behaviors. That's a really great time to be like, cool, like maybe there's some pieces missing to our puzzle, right? And I think that even in treatment, right? Even with us, like we treat with eating disorders, and sometimes the treatment, you're like, all right, what we are doing, how we are coming with this is not clicking. There's something missing. And it may just be like, you know what? Our level of care is not high enough. We actually need more.
And that's where you go in-house treatment or in-hospital type of treatment, where it needs to be 100% of the day focus on that.
Yeah. Yeah. You have like the day programs and inpatient residential that are like the higher level of care for folks.
Yeah. The other advice I give to coaches, and you tell me your opinion on that, anytime there is violence to the body, right? So we're talking purging, for an example. When people use any type of violence to the body as to help either lose weight or want to lose weight, there's danger to the health of the body. For me, that's a referral out to an eating disorder specialist. Is that correct?
I would agree, but it's hard because also like restriction.
It's not black and white.
Yeah, because even like chronic restriction is a threat and violence to the body, like purging for sure as well. But even those cycle of like binge eating, like there's so much, that it gets really kind of murky on the lines of like, when is it a higher level of care referral, or when is it like maybe out of my scope where the intensity again of the symptoms are maybe too high, or it's not just like, I find for me with my clients, because we do have different options in terms of like, we do disordered eating and we do eating disorders. And we find oftentimes the folks who are in the disordered eating category are more like the chronic dieters who are, there's still a lot of body image issues. There are some disordered patterns with food, but it's maybe more cyclical comparison to someone with an ED. And it's not as like overbearing over their life as it would be with an eating disorder.
So what would be your advice to coaches who are not skilled, licensed to work with eating disorder? When should we think about referring out?
Yeah, I think first, like, it's just the awareness of yourself too. Like, is it out of your scope? And even being able to name that is such a big thing to acknowledge. I find like to be able to be like, hey, and this is out of my scope, and actually like me supporting this person may cause more harm. And I want to talk about this very fast, because when someone raises their hand to engage in treatment when they have an eating disorder, it's a big fucking deal. Like, it's so big because it's hard. It's really hard to say like, hey, I need help in my recovery. And it's such a beautiful, but also vulnerable opportunity when we are a provider to start on the treatment. If the treatment is not adequate for their level of care, there's a few things that can happen. And one of them can be complete disengagement from care and feeling very hopeless with their recovery and then no longer accessing care. So when we think about it from that view, like, it can be quite harmful to support someone where we don't have the skills or the ability to support them, especially if it disengages them from care totally. So I think that first piece of like the awareness of like, okay, so what is my zone of practice? What is my scope? What do I feel comfortable with? And when that person or the symptoms or where they're at is out of that scope, I would definitely say like, that's the time where we would want to refer out and be able to have, someone else being able to take care of that person and provide the right treatment for them.
And So I'll get you to that place. You're somebody we can refer out to. What does that process look like?
Yeah. So the way that we start the process with folks is honestly just connecting with them. So we do have connection calls with all of our new clients. And the
Okay.
reason being because we work from a anti-diet and weight inclusive approach. And I think it's
Yeah.
important for people to know when they start working
You
with
wouldn't be on that podcast if you weren't.
yeah, we wouldn't be here today. But it's one
No.
the amount of people, they will try to book in and whatever, and they're like, oh, I want this and weight loss. And we're like, cool, but no, like, here's why we won't do that. So I really like having these conversations with every person who comes into the practice. So they kind of know our values, know the way that we're going to work, and really set expectations for treatment. Because another thing, when we don't set expectations for treatment, that can also lead to disengagement because then we're like, oh, wait, this is much more uncomfortable than what I realized it was going to be. So that would be the first step. So they connect with either me or the admin on the team, and then we are able to start our assessment. So most folks at the practice, if they have an eating disorder, they're working with both a dietitian and a therapist to be able to really kind of provide that multidisciplinary approach. And if they are under the age of 25, their families are also involved in care. So we do have, so we do have like families.
Is it by choice in your practice or that's requirement?
It's highly preferred.
Perfect.
We will not do it if family dynamics are going to hinder recovery, or maybe the parents are not safe people to include it in the recovery, or if for any reason they're not really engaged, so they don't live in the same country or anything like that, and then it doesn't make as much sense. But if the person is living at home or their parents is part of the support system, we're 100% including them. And the biggest reason for that is that we really believe in setting up the environment for success. And if you are living in a space where you're trying to recover and your parents are just like spewing diet
culture and fat phobia this way, it's not going to go well.
It's going to be real hard for the person to try to maintain recovery. So we really want to have that approach of like, yeah, we're helping the person heal, but we're really wanting to have the household heal as well.
And how, as a professional, if they want to refer out someone, do they get in touch with you? How does that work?
Yeah. So they can either just send us an email, honestly, like info@the-balance practice. Like me and Haley on my team were like constantly on our emails, which is like a quality of mine, but also a big flaw of mine.
Yeah.
So that's honestly the best way, and just let us know, and then we'll be able to take over and manage. And if you have this person and we have consent, then we would also connect with you just to be sure that we do like a proper transition of care as well.
Yeah, that's collaboration, which is essential. So
it's so essential.
So if you had tips or advice for coaches, intuitive eating coaches or body image coaches, non-diet coaches in general, what would you leave this conversation with so they would know?
That's a big question. I think honestly, I think a couple of things. One, I think that continued education piece is so beautiful, so important, because most of us, well, I mean, we were all born in diet culture, but we're also not taught this. So like learning it and continuing to invest in your learning, I think honestly is one of the most amazing things. But then I would also say like being extremely client-centered, because even within the anti-diet world and weight inclusive world, like every person is so different. So being able to connect with them, their stories, their whys, their habits, their family dynamics, just everything that the person kind of brings to the therapy room or the dietetic room or whatever room you're in, I think really is so supportive. And I have really found in my work that sometimes with my clients, just having someone who truly sees them and hears them and holds space for the way that they show up and the way they want to present that day is like almost the most healing part of our work over everything else that we're doing.
And you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, and maybe we'll close on this, you wouldn't be able to do what you do today if you didn't have your psychology background. Talk to me a little bit about that, because I really think and push mindset in the world of intuitive eating coaching, because I think it's the key to all, but I would love to have your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, and I agree with you. My degree in nutrition did not prepare me for this work.
Yeah.
The nicest way I want to say it. Like, it was great. I got a lot of nutrition science. I understand how the body works, how the metabolism works, like 10 out of 10. However, when we think about food relationship, eating disorder, body image, that degree did not give me the tools that I needed. I really, really believe that we cannot talk about nutrition without psychology. Because most people, I mean, you can Google it. Honestly, like most of my clients know more about nutrition than I do most of the time
because we come to a point where we don't care.
yeah,
Like as nutritionists, we're like, yeah, that's not the problem.
that's not the problem. And like most of them are so obsessed with food.
Yeah.
So me telling them like, hey, we should add some vegetables and some fruits on your plate, like it's really not the vibe. So I really think it's that piece of like the way that we relate to food, the emotions, the behaviors behind food, the thoughts, the beliefs that we have is truly what impacts the food relationship. So without my psych degree and without the continued education, you just can't really do this work with just like nutrition one-on-one education.
No, actually, what I found, to give my opinion on this, is just the nutrition information was harming people.
Mm-hmm.
Because depending when you went to school, you learn a certain way of thinking about food, right? So I was passing on information about food that was actually causing harm.
Yeah.
It was not helping the behavior at all.
100%. Like it's this idea of telling people like, oh, just eat this or just eat that. Like, why do we think that that's going to help? I don't know. It's just wild. It's just wild.
But what for me is crazy is that we were taught nutrition to help change behavior, right? Go into the world and pass on information, and people will eat better because of your knowledge about nutrition. But when I got into the cognitive behavioral world, it's like, but hold on here. What creates the behavior is not the intellectual nutrition. It's the emotion. Oh, and the emotion is the thought. Like, why would I not thought that in school?
Yeah, I know. It's pretty interesting, but I think it's really an old system, right? That's kind of like,
Maybe.
if you are the expert, people listen to experts. And I think we're really breaking that gap between like, and I know here at the practice, like, I'm not going to be like, hey, I am the professional and like, here's what you shall do, right? It's a very different approach where we're like, no, we're just connecting together on this human level and being able to work through it together. But I feel like it's very that much older vibe of like, oh, just tell your client things and they will listen to you because you are the expert. But I'm like,
They will obey.
gosh, isn't it weird? Yeah.
It was a pleasure having the discussion with you. We will put the information of your practice in the show notes for people to use as a referral. And I know this will become a staple because a lot of coaches want to understand the difference. So thank you very much for your education.
No, thank you so much for just allowing me to be here and share about this work. It was great.
And where is the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, so everything now is at The Balance Practice. So thebalancepractice.com, The Balance Practice on Instagram. Yeah, that's really the best place for the practice for eating disorder work.
And you have a podcast, right?
And we have a podcast and you're coming on the podcast.
I know. It's like, let's pitch the podcast on the podcast.
Yeah. Come listen to Steph on the podcast, guys. So the podcast, actually, we just had a name change. And the podcast is called Healed, with the last two, like, E in caps. Because, you know.
Brilliant marketing.
I know. I love that so much. I was like, this is probably my best work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have episodes all around eating disorder care and disordered eating from like the team at the practice. Perfect. And healthcare providers. So you can listen there.
Awesome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Ready to shed diet culture from your practice and help more clients do the same? Awesome. We've got free resources to get you started. Simply go to stephaniedodier.com/pro series, all in one word, and access our 3 free training classes that are currently available. We also have a free PDF guide to intuitive eating and article about the non-diet approach. We also offer a variety of paid programs throughout the year to support you in your journey to undiet your coaching practice. Join us at stephaniedodier.com/pro series, and I'll see you on the other side.